is the following. I'm assuming, if I'm not mistaken, that there is something on my screen that shows the title of the film, and this is what we're going to be discussing: Oppenheimer, the film. Can I just get from folk a thumbs up if you can see the title of the film?
No, we don't see you sharing your screen.
Okay, okay, let me go here. Here we go. How about that?
Okay, now it's starting. Yeah, now we see it. Okay.
Okay, so here we are. And thank you for being here. And thank you for your interest in this discussion about Oppenheimer, this important film that has given us the opportunity and, if you like, facilitated a broadening discussion on peace and the implications for peace as a result not only of the work of Oppenheimer and his team in Los Alamos, but also the impact of the use of the bomb and the long-standing and historical efforts, not only to reduce the use of the bomb, but to pursue peace as actively as we possibly can, both in the peace movement and in a number of different locations around the world, against the madness of nuclear stupidity and the potential for complete annihilation of our race. So we're going to be discussing this film, as you can see on the screen, and this is how we'll progress. We're going to be talking about context is everything, so really as much about the film in the foreground as a work of cinema, and that's partly my interest and part of my skill set as a communication specialist, but also then we want to talk about what was going on in US society at the time and what continues to go on in the context in which the struggle against nuclear proliferation takes place, the struggle against nuclear war, the struggle for peace, and so on. Major challenges to all of us in the peace movement and those committed to the interests of human flourishing. So as you can see on the screen, I hope behind a smallish image of Oppenheimer himself, an artistic representation. We'll see. You can see that who the discussants are: Elaine Scarry, Norman Markowitz, and Susan Mursky. Their bios are published and printed with the brochure for this event. I'm not going to rehearse that material. Each of us and each of them are qualified in their own way, and I'm sure that we'll enjoy everything that they have to say. We welcome then the opportunity after each of us has spoken for 10 minutes. Then we will have comments and questions from each of the speakers, and the speakers will then interact with each other. So there'll be some interrogative interactions there, and then we'll open the webinar for whomever would like to participate with a question or comment or observations, which I'm sure there'll be many. And as we move in, let's keep in mind the rather disturbing and frankly shocking reality of what we're really here to talk about. Not only this quote that Oppenheimer ripped off from ancient philosophers, but the image here of the total devastation of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the appalling and frightening threat that nuclear war is all about, and that the development by the United States of the bomb really represented. The film, if I may say, tells a very stark and dramatic story of a man versed not only in the brilliance of atomic physics and nuclear physics, but also in the refinements of ethics and in the refinements of, if you like, philosophy, very many aspects of philosophy that Oppenheimer, surely a polymath by any definition, was drawn to and engaged with. Christopher Nolan has done quite an effective job at bringing these many different interests to bear in this wonderful film. I should note by way of conclusion, by the way, before I pass over to Elaine, that an elderly friend of mine, who may or may not be here tonight, I can't see quite now, commented that he went to the film and went to one of these very new, smooth cinemaplexes where you sit in a chair and you can push a button and it reclines back and it's soft and very welcoming and actually perhaps too welcoming. He thought that perhaps this was going to be the one of those films where the movie started and he fell asleep. But it was exactly the opposite. He was completely, and like I'm sure many of us shared this experience, completely taken up with the brilliance of the narrative, the challenges, ethical, moral, personal, that were presented, and then, if you like, the shock of the kinds of behavior that were presented in the film about the behavior of US government officials, including, of course, President Truman and his attitude towards Oppenheimer when he saw the appalling situation that he'd unleashed on the world. And with that, and without further ado, I will say thank you for the minute and hand over to Susan. Sorry, I will hand over to Elaine.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that some of you know that the work that I do on a day-to-day basis and have done for the last 50 years is to teach students about artworks. And for almost that same length of time, I've also, 30 years or so, I've worked attempting to reduce the nuclear peril. But the two of those subjects almost never come together. And that's not just because great artworks aren't usually about the nuclear peril. Great artworks usually are not able to address and remedy huge moral problems. They certainly change and refine our perceptions on a one-on-one basis, but they seldom bring about a moral revolution. There are exceptions. One exception, a very famous exception, is the 19th century work, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is credited with, as President Lincoln said, with starting the Civil War, and in any case, with awakening many people who had been asleep about the nature of slavery to its reality. A second example that's given sometimes is the work by E.M. Forster called Passage to India. That was published in 1924. According to the poet Stephen Spender, the next morning, all of Britain woke up having a changed view of their relation to India and understanding that colonial subjugation was intolerable. Christopher Nolan has done something that at least has a chance of bringing about a kind of moral revolution. And the nuclear peril, we know, is at least as obscene as slavery and colonial subjugation. It's also important that the population of the United States largely got to all see the film at the same time, within a sense of a few days or a few weeks. Now, many dimensions of this film have been widely and justly celebrated. The film script, the supreme acting by Cillian Murphy, Emily Blunt, Matt Damon, Robert Downing, Florence Pugh, and others, the high quality of the book on which it was based by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, the incredible soundscape, including the chosen moments of stunning silence. And I want to, in the short time I have, to just focus on three features. One is the brilliant and powerful ending. From the opening moment of the film, we've seen raindrops in water rippling out to wider and wider circumference, an image that we can see at intervals and again at the very end, and an image which conveys that events don't just happen in solitude, they have mounting and continuous consequences. The end of the film is really like a powerful punch to the stomach or the head, certainly to our bodies. I'm sure you all remember the ending. Oppenheimer and Einstein are in conversation, a conversation we've seen before in the films at a distance without understanding what the content of the conversation is. Now we hear the conversation. Oppenheimer, Albert, when I came to you with those calculations, we were worried that we'd start a chain reaction that would destroy the entire world. Einstein, I remember it well. What of it? Oppenheimer, I believe we did. So we now see a planet with mounting fountains of nuclear explosions. What the conclusion of the film does is to make us understand that we are inside a nuclear reaction. If you look at any dictionary definition of a chain reaction, it will tell you that it's an action which initiates a similar action that becomes nonstop. And in the case of a nuclear reaction, a neutron strikes a uranium-235 nucleus, causing the nucleus to undergo fission, which releases a neutron, which in turn causes similar fission of adjacent nuclei and more neutrons. I'm quoting the Oxford Dictionary. This happens very quickly. In fact, the released neutron travels at speeds at about 10 million meters per second. And by the time it moves across the material that's there to be detonated, the time that has elapsed is a microsecond, a millionth of a second. The Los Alamos scientists, according to the website Atomic Archive, referred to this time as a shake, and it stood for a shake of a lamb's tail. That is a very short time. What happens in the final moment of this film is we're almost lifted up bodily and placed ourselves inside the chain reaction. We comprehend that this agonizing 77-year-long period since the invention of atomic weapons in the cosmic scheme of things is just the shake of a lamb's tail, a microsecond in slow motion, and that we're now moving relentlessly forward to the conclusion of this chain reaction. We know that many people wept at the end of the film. We know that many remained in their seats as though spellbound. We know that people stood outside the theater as though stunned. When the film opened in Paris before it played here in the United States, one critic wrote, "The word that keeps coming to mind is fearsome, a relentlessly paced, detailed, intricate historical drama that builds and builds and builds until Nolan brings down the hammer in the most astonishing, shattering way." And that is the moment that I referred to. Notice that all this happened just with a conversation that was 35 words long. And we feel the power of language as one of the things that's about to be lost. I move now to a second brilliant attribute of the film, which is the narrative, which goes from the creation of the bomb to the recognition of its consequences, but not in chronological order. Instead, we move through two spiraling strands of narrative, one of which is the interrogation of Robert Oppenheimer, and the second of which is the interrogation of Louis Strauss. The first leads to the humiliation of Oppenheimer and the taking away of his national security clearance, and the second leads to the humiliation of Strauss and the vote that determines that he will not become part of Eisenhower's cabinet. Among criticisms of the film, some have said that losing your security clearance or losing a seat in the cabinet are both trivial matters compared to the making and possession of nuclear weapons. But what the humiliation of Oppenheimer shows is that none of us, not even Oppenheimer, not even the Prometheus who made the bomb, has any voice to impede the use of nuclear weapons. And what the Strauss congressional inquiry shows is that the part played in national events by incredibly small human egos. Even if we acknowledge that these storylines are trivial, that in itself is an important lesson, because we learn that compared to the physical and moral harm of nuclear weapons, every human story is trivial. There is no love story, no suicide, no anything that is not made to appear trivial by nuclear weapons. That's one of its horrors. The film continually requires us to see how out of scale nuclear weapons are. They destroy us even before they destroy us. They miniaturize and trivialize us because they wipe us away from the surface of the earth. The film is full of injured egos, and all we have is our human psyches or our human egos, and placing such human egos in charge or to be guardians of such weapons must end in catastrophe. The third and final point I would like to address is a criticism that peace activists I've sometimes heard make that the injuries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not shown. It's very painful to me to think of the people of Japan hearing about what a magnificent film Chris Nolan has made, but also hearing about the bewildering fact that the injuries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not shown, except at the moment when Oppenheimer hallucinates the injuries as he addresses the Los Alamos scientists on the night of the Hiroshima bombing, night after the Hiroshima bombing, or again, when we watch Christopher Nolan's face as he's looking at a medical film of the consequences, a film that we ourselves can't see. But what I have to say is this: if that is a fault, it's our fault, the American people's fault, not Christopher Nolan's fault, for two reasons. First, we have not ourselves had any practice in looking at the injuries of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Any of you who have been to those two cities have been to the museums and know that they're always full of tiny school children who courageously look face to face at records of those injuries. But in our own country, even adults can't do this. For example, at one point, Joseph Gearson and I organized a month-long program at one of the Cambridge public libraries. The first thing we did was put up a small exhibit. By the first morning, the librarians had taken down any pictures of injury. This happens across the country. When the Smithsonian tried to put on an exhibit on the 50th anniversary, there was such controversy that they had to cancel the exhibit and in fact only showed the plane that had brought about the injury. The second reason is that look at what the place of injury is in American films. I went to the Oppenheimer film. Actually, I've seen it 3 times, but the first time I actually wrote down what injuries occurred just in the previews before the film began. And they had included the following. First, we hear about people speaking about neutralizing a target. Then we see someone lifting an axe. Then we see a bloody face. A second film comes, and in this preview, we see 3 punches, an explosion, gunfire, and explosion. Then there's a preview of a film about a cleaning woman, which mercifully had no injuries. Then there's a 4th film, seemingly a comedy, but a person tries to do a flip and lets out a yelp of pain. Then a 5th preview comes with a cut on a leg inflicted every 3 days, then a cut face, and so on. This is our American film world. It is not a sympathetic depiction of injury. It is not an attempt to get people to understand the felt experience of injury, just the reverse. It's often there to entertain or thrill or to excite the audience. Now, for Christopher Nolan to walk into the middle of this and show the horror of the injuries at Nagasaki and Hiroshima would have been a tall order. And instead, he did something that I believe is brilliant, and that is the one person whose face we see melting away. The person he had playing that was his own daughter. That is, rather than maim even the representation of an Asian person's face or a stranger's face, he had someone in his own family agree to have to suffer that damaging representation. And this, like almost every detail of the film, strikes me as an ethically laden decision. It's a film that shows the beauty of the world in the New Mexico landscape when it's not being exploded, the beauty of countless human faces when we're at peace, and the beauty of education when, as in the early parts of the film, we see Oppenheimer traveling to UK, to Germany, and to the Netherlands. And with there, I'll stop and look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elaine. And you've offered us a significant amount of material with which to work and to provoke our thoughts and our discussion later on. Let's now turn to Norman. You can unmute yourself, Norman, please, and then we will hear from you. And Elaine, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, so that we can be good to go. Okay, thank you, Norman.
My name is Norman Markowitz. I am a Marxist historian. I am an open and active member of the Communist Party of the United States, and have been, and have paid many, many consequences for that since 1978. I make no bones about that. The very word frightens people. Hopefully it doesn't frighten the people here. I teach history. I teach the history of the United States in the 20th century. I teach the history of imperialism. I teach the history of socialism and communism, among other questions. Now, let me begin, and I'll try to be relatively brief. Hollywood films have always sought to both entertain and educate, to play with and help to shape conventional wisdoms on a wide variety of topics, although such films have been constrained not only by the dictates of the studio owners and distributors, but also by various forms of formal and informal censorship. In the 1930s, perhaps the most famous practical analysis of Hollywood's role in society was made by James Rorty, his contention that Hollywood functioned as a dream factory, enabling people to gain release from the daily grind of the Depression and reassurance about the parameters of what was and what wasn't permissible. This is a brilliant film aesthetically. Everything that Elaine said about it, I would agree with, but ultimately, a film that deals with history has got to deal with the relationships. And here I see this film as very seriously flawed in terms of the relationships and the context. First, the film reflects one age expressions from the 1920s on, and I've written about films and history fairly widely in non-academic, even some academic publications. The film reflects the American rugged individualist hero, played by Gary Cooper, Jimmy Stewart, in better films, Henry Fonda, strong, passionate, eloquent, who ultimately triumphs over adversity. The film reflects this from beginning to end. I have 7 points, and I will make them about the context of the film. What I see is important omissions from my perspective. If you disagree, that's fine. First, fascism as the ideology of the Axis powers. It's racist, imperialist policy, and its barbarism in Europe and Asia really does not exist. It is largely omitted in the film. Communists, especially the women in Oppenheimer's wife, Kitty, who becomes his wife, Jean Tatlock, are portrayed on the whole sympathetically. This is not a Red Bader's film by any means, but the role of the Communist Party in organizing broad People's Front coalitions in the 1930s against racism, against anti-Semitism, to defend the Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War, its alliance with and through the New Deal government of Franklin Roosevelt, and then during the war, its organization and struggle around the Win the War coalition does not exist here, nor does the role of communist partisans throughout Europe and Asia, the Red Army of the Soviet Union, what became the People's Liberation Army of China, in defeating the armies of Hitler and the Japanese imperialists. These forces made the most significant contribution to the victory over the fascist Axis in World War II. And this doesn't exist in the film. Oppenheimer's being Jewish is highlighted. But the anti-Semitic subtext, and I've written about this in the United States and other countries, but particularly the United States, of the domestic Cold War, aka McCarthyism, really doesn't exist here. Particularly the execution, the political execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for, quote, stealing the secret of the atomic bomb, which, as one scientist later involved in the building of the atomic bomb said famously, the atom bomb was an industry, not a recipe, not a recipe. Although that scientist didn't speak for the Rosenbergs in 1950, of course, Oppenheimer didn't. Really, nobody did. Nobody did. The fact that Judge Kaufman was Jewish, others, particularly Roy Cohn, were Jewish, that who carried forward the prosecution shouldn't be seen as evidence that anti-Semitism is not central to what was happening, or important, because, and frankly, in the Soviet Union, when the Jewish figures of the Soviet opposition to Israel and its support for the Arab countries in Stalin's last years faced all kinds of persecution, many of the people leading the attack on them were also Jewish. A minor point, perhaps. Let me also say that the fact that the communist movement and the Soviet Union, in the 1930s particularly, and afterwards, were the most important opponents of racist anti-Semitism, organizers against racist anti-Semitism in the world, explains why many Jewish people in the United States and other countries, just as oppressed minorities through, in effect, and drawn to progressive and revolutionary movements, and particularly the communist movement. Okay. Point 4, the opposition of the scientists. I have the July 1945 petition to Truman, which he of course ignored, warning about the dangers of using the bomb. 67 scientists signed that petition. Oppenheimer wasn't one of them, of course. And the opposition of the military, particularly General Dwight Eisenhower, who stated clearly, the commander of US forces in Europe, that the bomb was not necessary to end the war, as it wasn't. Point 5, Truman's refusal not to use the bomb, his subsequent refusal to develop any policy for nuclear disarmament, his support for Edward Teller in the development of the hydrogen bomb. True, this is portrayed and positively, but it isn't connected, and this to me, given the documentation, is very important. It isn't connected directly to his policy of forcing the Soviets out of the East European countries, which they liberated. And he made this case clearly at the Potsdam Conference when he informed, or when he said to his Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, Secretary of State, that once he was informed of the success of the Los Alamos test, would be an equalizer against the Red Army in Europe and, quote, a hammer to threaten the Soviets with if they rejected US policies. And of course, as I think many of us know or should know, he mentioned the bomb's test the Los Alamos test to Joseph Stalin at Potsdam. Okay, point 6, Edward Teller and Louis Strauss are rightly perceived very negatively as villains, essentially, and they were. And here, I would have liked to have seen Strauss, who spread outright lies. He orchestrated the removal of security clearance, outright lies through the early about nuclear radiation, through mass media. Films that were made by the Defense Department, that was seen on television, explaining that there was no real danger from nuclear radiation. And he lied about the disasters that were the direct result of the US nuclear tests. I would have highlighted this. Final point. The film essentially becomes a vindication of Oppenheimer in the tradition of the ruggedly individualist American hero. He becomes, in the best sense, Mr. Smith going to Washington. He becomes, in the best sense, John Doe. But was he really vindicated in any serious way? Ultimately, he received the Fermi Award. His security clearance was restored. Strauss went down. Teller didn't go down, of course. Was he vindicated? And ultimately, and I have 2 minutes if it can be shown. If not, great. I understand that from this interview that he gave with CBS 2 years before he died in 1965, in which he reflected, as I see it, much of what became the Cold War liberal consensus that Lyndon Johnson would carry forward in Vietnam. I'm finished. If you can do it, great. If you can't, okay.
Here we go, Norman.
Okay. 4:30 to, not the whole film, but 4:30. Okay. If you can get it to 4:30. Okay.
The manifest causes of conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, which have bedeviled us for 20 years, and which are by no means in any conventional sense solved, when you remember the ideological ferocity that animated the post-war communists and that we see now in the Chinese in unmuted form. You think of the anti-communist ferocity with which we met this, the notion that there is a telephone communication between the White House and the Kremlin to make sure that there are no misunderstandings is a damn new pattern of behavior. I think it's something that almost without precedent in wars in conflicts which have such a total character as that between the communists and the free world has tended to have. I think the notion that the United States should be fixing up its power to fight limited engagements on the ground and in the air with old-fashioned weapons that we hope are a little better than they used to be, not as a step in conquering the world, but as a step in a chance to persuade before cost. That's a pattern that I believe is not familiar either. When you think that
it goes on.
for years, the intellectuals of Russia were interested in France and the United Kingdom.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman, and thank you for that opportunity to hear the voice of Oppenheimer himself. I think that's valuable. given that we're dealing with a feature film with lots of actors. And thank you for those insights into the importance of the discussion, which we have to acknowledge is really foregrounded in this film, and that is the discussion of the Communist Party of the United States and its role in the powerful and challenging aspects of history, which to all intents and purposes, we are still really very much in. We've had suppression of all sorts of political activities in our country, and certainly there's no shortage of them continuing. So thank you, Norman, for that context and for helping us to gain a better understanding, along with Elaine's comments, on the achievements of this film, courtesy of the director, Christopher Nolan. I'll hand over to Susan Mirsky, and she's going to make some comments about her own observations of the Cold War and the issues that emerged growing up and being a younger person during those years. Thank you, Susan.
Hi, thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Norman and Elaine. When Marcus asked me to speak, I said, I am not a speaker. I am not a writer. I'm an organizer. But he convinced me that I should tell my story. And in that sense, I look out at the participants, and I think that most all of you have stories, and those stories are important. It's important to understand ourselves, where we come from, our experiences, our inputs that help us go on and become activists in any way that we can. So I don't have anything written. I'm just gonna go for it. We did some, we handed out postcards and flyers at the showing of Oppenheimer. And, I think this happened all over the country. But here in Massachusetts, that's what we did. And varying results, people, gave their thoughts about it. Some, said, oh, it was too much, it went too fast. Some people said, well, it didn't show the effects of the bombing. It didn't talk about, it didn't deal with the testing, the effects of the testing. But the last time that I gave out postcards, you approach people and you start talking, or you give them something. And this couple, they were, maybe my age, maybe a little bit older. And at first they didn't want to say anything. They sort of, they moved away from me, as people do. And you get that sense, oh, they're not gonna accept anything from me. But as I said just a little bit, the wife turned to me, the woman turned to me, and she said, this was a great film, because what happened to Oppenheimer and the political lay of the land that was happening then is now. Yes, absolutely right. And then she started talking. And then her husband, who didn't want to have anything to do with this at first, he came into the conversation and he started talking. And it turned out that, I think in my memory, he had talked with or interviewed or knew Oppenheimer's brother, I think. And then that was their story and their understanding and their involvement with this. So I go back to my story. I came from a very left-wing family, and early on, I knew that our telephone was being tapped. So of course, as kids, we would say, we'd end many conversations with, and whoever is listening, hope you enjoyed this. I also grew up with the feeling that being Russian, and of course my grandparents were Russian, they were all from the Ukraine, but they were Russian and Jewish, but Russian Jews from the Ukraine. That to have ancestry or to be identified as Russian was something that was not to be shared with friends. Also not to be shared with friends were political beliefs. And thus what ended up happening was having a certain group of, sort of like an extended family. And this was growing up in New Jersey, of like-minded people, friends with similar, many communists, many socialists, people with political, similar beliefs, who were supportive and who you could talk with, but not to the general, not to friends at school, not to neighbors, especially when somebody came knocking at our door, giving a subpoena and going out to neighbors. But also, a part of my growing up was of realizing that what I was reading or what I was hearing about was very limited. And that, we had the I.F. Stone Weekly. I don't know if any of you remember that. That was great. But information, I remember in junior high school wanting to know about the Spanish Civil War. And there was a very short paragraph in a book about the Spanish Civil War. Hiroshima, dropping of the bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, very little written about that, but talked about in my family. Then as a teenager, my parents would say that anything that the Soviet Union was doing was good. And as a teenager, of course, I said, no, what Stalin is not good. He did all these terrible things. And part of it was just being an obnoxious teenager wanting to get my parents upset. But in that, being an obnoxious teenager and getting my parents upset, I also developed the sense of what is really going on, what has really been going on, and how do I get information? And that has continued. And I think there's an element of that is even more severe now, that the reporting of what is happening in Russia is very limited, that people who want to show any other narrative other than what is written in our newspapers, they are limited or shut down. Newspaper reporters are limited or shut down. There is not much out there that in the public venue that gives you a real sense of what is happening. And unfortunately, to tell you the truth, I don't know what to believe. And I read newspapers sometimes. I hear people talking, giving reports, and I don't know whether to believe that or not. So that dynamic is very undermining to one's sense of organizing. Because when you don't know what's happening, you can't say, let's do this or do that. I'm very aware of, from my background, the whole issue of Russophobia. And that's happening now. I don't, but my personal beliefs, I don't think that Putin is a great guy, but I don't think that he is also the invention of the devil. And we talk about the Ukraine war. That's very difficult to talk about because we don't get a sense of what is really happening. And yes, I feel that Russia came in and was the aggressor in that sense, but definitely this was not an unprovoked war. This was provoked, and we provoked it. But there were lots of things that went into this Ukraine war. And to really think about whatever it was, we have to try to come to some action, some working to a peace and a diplomacy and an end to the war, no matter what we believe is a cause of it. Although I'm, trying to understand as much as possible the cause. To take action is really important, and for all of us, our actions are part of our history and our stories. And I hope that you all have a chance to share your histories and your own stories, because that's very important. All of you, all 96 participants, you all have stories, all important. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Wonderful. Thank you. And certainly what the film tells us, just like you've told us, is a powerful and important story. And certainly, before I open it up for questions, can I just say that the importance of cinema for us is to tell stories that go beyond the normal characteristics of our day-to-day lives and take us into an imaginary set of possibilities, into the sort of subconscious and the possibilities of the vast human potential in the horizon. When we're seeing Elaine in that cinema and in that picture theatre, it's something wonderful that we can take away. And certainly the story that's been told in Oppenheimer is a story that I think we can share and recognise as a provocation for peace. Let's see, firstly, if anybody, we're very running close on time, so anybody from the speakers, Elaine or Norman, have anything quickly to add? And then we'll see where we go.
No, I think we should just open it up to the audience.
Okay. Quick, well, just quick questions. Is that okay, Norman?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, so quick questions, please, because our time is limited, and we'll see where we go. Jeffrey Barkdale has his hand up.
Okay.
I got 3 real quick. Even though Marcus Breen said this is not the forum in which to raise this kind of question, it's not about. I'm still probably going to mention it anyway. But 2 are for all of you, and while 1 is straight for Norman Markowitz.
Markowitz.
Okay. All right. Okay. I did meant the Oppenheimer film didn't mention about I was actually gonna mention about the. I had an idea to actually help end nuclear weapons. Like saying, if this is what nuclear weapons can do, I want them disarmed. Like the actual doing a U.S. and Japanese co-produced film on the actual atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, directly seeing the horrific damage that's caused and destruction, death, and all that that the film that the atomic bombs caused, and even the government's trying to cover up.
Right.
What do you think of that?
So Jeffrey, let's leave it there. That's your one comment. Quick response, Norman or Elaine?
Okay, well, the devastation, we know the devastation, and there are documentaries, but most people have buried this. This is the reality of our media-saturated society, and it's what we must fight against. As we are bombarded with information, we turn off and shut off. And how we can fight this is one of the major questions that we should ask amongst ourselves.
Thank you. Elaine?
No, just the thought that, it occurs to me that maybe Christopher Nolan himself will do a second film where he tries to take on that very, very important reality of the harm that was done.
Yeah.
But if not, then other people need to do it, and there need to be many attempts.
Yes. Well, let's all send him a note, and
Okay.
maybe
I have
we'll
a quick,
one of them we'll get to. Go on.
Jeffrey had asked me in the chat about what would have happened if Henry Wallace had not been defeated by Harry Truman. Wallace was a scientist. Wallace was aware of the nuclear project. But frankly, I don't think the bomb would have been dropped. But at the same time, given the balance of political forces in the United States, I think that Wallace would have been subject to a massive attack and possible impeachment.
Okay. William Root.
Yes, I'm a World War II veteran, and I never met another World War II veteran who was not strongly appreciative of what the Russians did on the Eastern Front at a tremendous loss.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, if Truman was right, I have a guilty conscience that I wouldn't have come back if we hadn't dropped the bomb, but I don't really believe that. And I think that we should look at it in very simple terms. The $1 trillion updating of our nuclear weapons is directly in opposition to a very simple proposition that Reagan and Gorbachev in 1986 almost agreed upon to abandon completely nuclear weapons. And the only thing that stopped them was when ABM raised its ugly head. And the ABM argument is totally bogus because of decoys making it impossible for ABM to be successful. So my real question is, let's keep it simple the way Reagan and Gorbachev tried to do it. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6, puts us on record to do it now, to negotiate now, to stop complete and general disarmament of nuclear weapons. Let's keep it simple.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Any comments? Thank you, William. Yes, Elaine.
I would just say that your first point about the incredible contribution of Russia on the Eastern Front is crucial, and it's actually one that Oppenheimer did repeatedly make, as reported in the Kai Bird biography. It's also mentioned in the film, but not as often as it is in the book. That he kept saying, "Why do we keep talking about them as the enemy? Do you realize how many of them are being killed on the Eastern Front?" And far before we went in to that terrain. So, and I certainly agree with you that we should be going for nuclear zero right now.
Yeah, I would briefly say that the Soviets lost 27 million people. Initially, the number was 20, largely because Joseph Stalin actually underrated the number because he feared that the larger number would be used against the Soviets. They also, until the D-Day invasion, took on close to 90% of all European Axis fascist forces. And had a second front been opened earlier, millions who perished would have survived. And that issue was deeply connected to the struggles over what became the Cold War. Okay.
Thank you. And we should.
Thank you, William. Your points were very fine.
Thank you, Norman. We could have a very informative discussion, I'm sure, at another time.
Yeah.
About the behaviour of the United States and British governments, especially in keeping the Second World War going, and it's useful. It's mentioned in the film a little bit as well. Also, to add that, of course, it was the Soviet or Red Army that came from across Europe, as it were, to help put an end to the Japanese. Which is often left out. So there are many things that are left out of the narratives, many things that are not part of our common or popular history that the film helps bring to the foreground. Sharon Rose.
Hold on, before you do, I need to say this real quick. I'm putting in the comments section the remaining questions that you can answer on your own time, including the one for you, Norman.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
So take a look for them.
Okay, Sharon.
Thank you. I'm here in Oakland, California. Thank you all very much. I really appreciated this discussion, a great food for thought. My question is, this kind of discussion needs to be out there in the public. What can we do? What is MAPA doing to further this kind of discussion? I was thinking of one thing, which might be to reach out to civics teachers in high schools or college, also college teachers, and suggest that, that they might want to show the film and have a discussion with their students, and that people like us, could help that along. But are you having other public meetings, and what do you recommend?
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate your enthusiasm, your encouragement for the fact that we just had this one event, and we can certainly think about having more. And there should be lots of brainstorming going on about how to utilize this film and the ideas within it. I mean, a good film is always driven by a good idea, and the good idea that drives this film is the horrors of nuclear war, and the subsidiary idea is the pursuit of peace. How do we get that into the curriculum? How do we get that into the schools? Susan, you had your hand up. You may have an answer.
I just want to say that, Sharon, that's a great idea to go to schools and have them put it in the curriculum, or have those teachers who are willing to have a discussion of the film. Obviously, they can't have a film, 3-hour film within a class, but great idea. Here in Massachusetts, what we did is we had postcards that we handed out, and those postcards said, where do you live? This is what could happen here. Where you live, you are this far away from a blast. And it related to having our senators endorse the Back from the Brink resolution, HRES 77. So that was a very focused activity. There are lots of other actions going on, but I know there are other questions.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Appreciate it. And we can give some more thought to that, and certainly welcome contributions from anybody here, going either to Susan or to Cole Harrison and those in the MAPA office. Leonard Lerman.
Thank you, Marcus, Breen. Thank you, Norman Markowitz, for really good programming and astute observations. I'm the former co-director of the National Committee to Reopen the Rosenberg case, and helped publish the final verdict by Walter and Miriam Schneer. And I look forward to communicating further with you, Norman, on that. The Rosenbergs are not mentioned in the film because, well, actually, they and the Green Lights whatever they gave to the Russians was very, very, very little value compared to Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall, who isn't mentioned, but who also information. But I want to mention though two significant works of art dealing with Oppenheimer and Hiroshima. There's an opera called Dr. Atomic, which we were led to believe would be very, very interesting and important along the lines of the play in the matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer. But it was a terrible disappointment because basically the libretto was more concerned with what General Groves had for breakfast than anything else. And seriously, it was almost, you know, like quasi-human drama, but it did not deal with the politics of the situation. Yeah. Lee Baxendall, who studied at the Brecht Berliner Ensemble just after Brecht died, but he studied there, and he came home and wrote a Requiem for Hiroshima, which he asked me to set to music, and was done at the Riverside Church in 1990 and out in Malvern Community Presbyterian Church in 1995. That's a work that says the Japanese were about to surrender. We dropped this bomb to stop them, but to stop the Russians from participating in the occupation of Japan. That's an important work. I hope someday soon that we can hear it again. And Norman, thank you, and thank you, Massachusetts Peace Action, for all that you do. And I hope that you, as we all hope, that you will do many more things like what you're doing tonight.
Thank you, Leonard. Can I also reiterate a point that Elaine made earlier about the proliferation of violence and pointless violence and gratuitous violence on our screens, incredible pointless stuff that creates a culture in which the kinds of things that we're talking about now, the movie, the music, the operas, any poetry. My friend Thomas O'Leary is here, a wonderful poet from Boston. You know, as much as we can within the communities in which we operate, circulate those things, those artifacts of peace and of creativity that work as counteractions to the violence that surround us in our media. That would be a point that I'd make. Ayong Choi.
Yes. Okay.
Please.
Yes.
Go ahead.
He's muted, I think. He's muted.
You are muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And now I'm calling in from New York. I just wanted to thank Elaine Scarry for the way she spoke about some of the stronger points of the film. One thing I wanted to say is that when I was about 15 years old, which is 10 years after the bombing in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, my family happened to move to live in Japan. So I am Korean American myself. And I'm a peace activist for peace on the Korean Peninsula. We were shocked to see when we arrived in Japan, not necessarily the people who were injured by the bombs, but the photographs of their injuries and these black and white photographs that were shown in various places and sometimes in the homes of the people who were hurt. Not only their injuries, but the deformities and the birth defects of the babies, of the mothers who were radiated, and the generation that followed even. So we are limiting ourselves to thinking about immediate injuries because the harm it goes on and on.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ayong. Yes. And
I agree with that entirely. And it's important to remember that in the months that followed the nuclear attacks, large numbers of people died of the effects of the attacks.
Absolutely.
And subsequently, as you said, over time.
That's right.
The deformed children, the reduced life expectancy, this was the reality.
Right.
This was the reality.
It was a legacy that lived on for generations.
Terrible, yes, indeed, terrible suffering. Or people who are interested might be, and I'm sure people know about the endless suffering that continues in Vietnam as a result of napalm and chemical use there, similar to the use of nuclear power, nuclear energy and so on in Japan. John Pallas.
Okay. Yes.
Yes, John.
So yeah, I guess I wanted to, just to be short, I thought Elaine Scarry's comment about placing these weapons in charge of human egos, must necessarily result in some kind of catastrophe. The thing is that makes it sound like humans are all bad. The fact is that the president has the authority to use the bombs, but the president also has the authority to refuse to use the bombs. And judging by what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if they'd actually shown it in the movie or paid any attention to the genocide, injustice, and immorality of the whole thing, well, the movie didn't do any of that. But the point is that our president, this is 2023. That was 1945. The world's different now. We can't afford, nuclear bombs are so useless. They're not practical weapons. Who can you use one on without hurting yourself? Who do you care so little about? We were putting Japanese Americans in internment camps in this country, and we hated them. Okay. Is that who we are? So all I'm saying is our president has the authority not to use the bombs. Our president is the guy or the gal who is going to introduce the treaty to the Senate if it's ever going to be ratified. The president is also going to be the person who signs the treaty once they approve it. So are we going to let another presidential election go by without ever asking the question to any of those presidential candidates, could you use one of these bombs? Who do you care so little about? How can you use them without hurting yourself? I think we can't miss this chance. And so that's really all I got to say.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. That's very helpful and a useful, positive and productive point, particularly as we enter into the endless election season. Go on, Nolan.
Quickly add some. I agree with you entirely, John. But I think it's important for us to remember, and we should raise the point that
anything to create a bomb.
Nuclear overkill
Allow someone
remains a reality.
Really interestingly worded.
The concept, I hear another voice, the concept of nuclear overkill, which means that if all the bombs went off theoretically, you could destroy the human race, remains true. What is interesting,
right, but you can argue about what's going to happen if you use how many bombs.
Right,
but the truth that to use one again, for the United States to use one again, that would be a war crime. That's not arguable.
I agree entirely. The problem we have is that the nuclear danger is not seen today. In the post-Cold War period, there are many more bombs, but people's consciousness and fear of nuclear war, which was enormous when I was growing up in the 1950s.
People have turned off the awareness. We don't do cover drills anymore.
Yeah.
We either fight, all you or anybody else preaches is fear, not rationality. So what you do with fear, you fight or you flee.
Okay. Right.
To fight, you want to have as many bombs as the other guy. If you want to flee the thing, you try to put it out of your mind and just forget all about it, because that's the best you can do. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Norman. Elaine, did you want to add anything?
Well, I just wanted to say that while there are tremendous differences among presidents, it's the architecture itself that puts this in the hands of one person that is lethal, not the bad nature of one person or another. And in fact, every president, but in every case where we know whether a president has or has not considered using weapons and using them first, when no other country had fired against us, they in every case have. Eisenhower twice came close to using one and certainly considered it. JFK 3 times. Nixon says it was 4 times. Lyndon Johnson says he considered using it against the Chinese to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. So the list goes on. This is not something where we can remedy it by electing somebody who says the right thing.
No, you just have to ask the question so the public gets to understand what the president has the authority to do. And so they will use that to determine who they'll vote for and get them thinking about passing that treaty that everybody wants. That's all I'm saying.
Thanks, John.
And
Thanks, John.
they didn't use those problems, did they?
Sorry. Thank you, John. Let's go to our next question from Louise Coleman. Or comment. You're muted, Louise.
Okay. Now, what I was wanting to mention was that in many ways, the Oppenheimer movie is a gift that we have much more public awareness after this movie's been out about the danger of nuclear weapons and what they mean. And it really is timely, especially with the awful situation in Ukraine, that it's very precarious. It's really is a gift, and it should be used to educate people. I have noticed that there's some more receptiveness in the press to talk about or to be aware of the danger of nuclear weapons. That I have been able to get more stories about nuclear weapons in the press and in interest. So it's, if people write letters to the editor, call up your local news and ask them, like, what are they covering? Why aren't they covering this? Pick up the phone. That's all you got to do. Pick up the phone. Don't send an email, because emails get lost. But pick up the phone and say, this is a story that you really want covered. And I've been really heartened by that there is more interest and more awareness.
Great. That's great, Louise. I noticed somebody just suggested having military contractors be not for profit. I mean, these are great ideas, that are a result from merely activating the neurons in our brains and having this conversation. Jellyfish.
Thanks. First of all, it's my understanding that it was evidently one of several Soviet sub-commanders who decided at the last minute to decline to launch nuclear weapons during the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis that avoided
Vasily Arkhipov.
Yes, and so it's not always just the president or the head of the Politburo or whatever. And thank God that
Vasily was there.
Caution, wisdom prevailed. And I don't know if Elaine wanted to comment on that particular situation in terms of the alleged chain of command. But the other question, which is mainly for Elaine, but anyone else who wants to comment, I heard Hans Bethe debate Edward Teller at the Kennedy School. I think it was in the 80s. It was during Reagan. Reagan was promoting Star Wars. Yeah. And Hans, who I met in another occasion at a reception, had a nice chat with him. He said, well, he was arguing against Star Wars, of course, and Teller at one point said, "But Hans, if you would help us, we could do it." Anyway, Bethe said, I think and I think you could probably find the video buried in the archives of the IOP or at the Kennedy School, but Bethe said he thought that it was probably not possible from his point of view to go down to 0 nuclear weapons, but rather each nuclear powers would have to keep maybe as many as 200, because if they didn't, then there would, because the genie is already out of the bottle, so to speak, that anybody out there could potentially get a nuclear weapon and then threaten people who didn't have any. So I'm curious what Elaine or anyone else might have to say to Hans Bethe's argument about not being able really to go down to 0 nuclear weapons. And thank you.
Thank you, Jellyfish.
Well, it's an important question, but the fact of the matter is that the existence of weapons increases the chance that someone will get hold of them. Yeah. I mean, you're imagining that you need 200 in case someone gets hold of them. But what enables people to get hold of them is that this country has 200 and another country has 200. We know that there have been hacking incidents, like a F-35 designed to drop nuclear weapons was hacked into. There have been other such incidents. And, I don't see the main threat as hackers, terrorists, or teenagers. I see the main threat as the military that have set up this arrangement and that plan to use it, that practice every day to use it. But for sure, the dangers are much higher if we have 200 than if we have 0. On your earlier point, I just want to say that, yes, there sometimes are 2 or 3 other people along the way. Now, people who work in missile silos like Bruce Blair point out that, people have been rigorously trained not to interfere with the transfer of a presidential command.
Right, amazing.
But the fact of the matter is that to talk about 1 person or 2 people or 12 people or 30 people is just a category error. The Constitution requires that you have 2 breaks on going to war. One is the congressional debate by 535 people, which is a very unwieldy thing. It's not going through 1 or 2 people. And then that you get the ratification from the population as well before you begin to injure. And this idea that, maybe if we just increase the presidential authority to 5 people, we'll feel better about it. No, I think that's wrong. I want to just quickly insert one other important point that Norman made about the work that communist people in America did on civil rights. I think a good book on that is by a young woman named Martha Biondi that shows the incredible work in the 1940s on trying to get rights for African Americans that the Communist Party was doing, and that was part of the motive for outlawing American communism.
That's good.
Marcus,
Thanks, Elaine.
I just like to add, so tangentially to this discussion about presidents' use of nuclear weapons, and that Elaine touched on, is the accidental use. And we know that there have been numerous incidents where this has almost happened. So it's in a way, it's much more likely to happen by accident, which is horrendous. And then also, on top of that, is what we are doing now. We are still doing plutonium pit mining, the devastation on the earth, and to the peoples where testing is being done is still happening. So there are various elements to the whole nuclear issue that we have to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Norman, quickly.
Very quickly, a documentary that I show in my classes, Atomic Cafe, really a wonderful.
Oh, that's a great movie.
Yes. But among other things, some of its most powerful moments is its showing of the nuclear exercise in the desert, where the soldiers go through the nuclear cloud to see its effects, And publicizing that and showing it widely would be a very, very good thing to do.
For the movie series.
Louise, could you mute yourself, please? Jeffrey Bachtel.
Sure.
Jeffrey.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
I already got the video link. Someone shared it, but the last one's for you. So I guess the last one's for you, Norman. Okay, I'm gonna phrase it out.
Yeah. What is it?
Because of ruthless communist dictators like the Kim family, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and Joseph Stalin, they are the reason I believe communism is evil. However, since you're a member of the Communist Party, can you prove that communism is not black and white, but
Well, yeah.
it's in shades of gray?
Well, yeah. I think it's important to, and these are complicated issues. There is a huge literature about Joseph Stalin by those who were victims of Joseph Stalin. What can you say? There were enormous achievements, and there were great failures and misery and devastation. There was the cult of personality. All of this happened, but the achievements were really enormous, including the victory in the Second World War, the rapid industrialization. These were enormous achievements, and they were seen as achievements throughout the world. Pol Pot, Mao Zedong is a major figure in the history of the 20th century. I don't see him as an evil tyrant. I see him as someone who led the second great socialist revolution in history. This is a system which began with the Soviet Revolution. It has developed and continues to develop in China, particularly, which is developing a new model of socialism. It has achieved enormous things, both under Mao Zedong and today under President Xi. Enormous things. And this the capitalist world realizes, which is why they have launched this Cold War II against the People's Republic of China.
They could do it.
Also, as for Pol Pot, very quickly, how was he created? He was basically an afterthought to the expansion of the Vietnam War. I can go into Pol Pot in great detail, and when we look at the capitalist tyrants, the tens of millions who have perished, the million in Indonesia who were murdered, communists and workers, with the support of the CIA, the Pinochet regime, regime after regime through the world, the massacres and atrocities that our government and the imperialist powers have supported and sanitized. And what did any of those governments create that was positive? And then, as I would say to that final question, that final point, life under capitalism and imperialism is a kind of death on the installment plan for tens of millions of people in the world.
At least you don't.
Okay.
At least you don't have to worry about the fear of losing your life in the under those people.
Thank you.
Because that's
What?
the real thing. They
Okay,
murdered
it's my
people.
turn. It's my turn.
Okay.
No, yes, we're not doing it back and forth here, Jeffrey.
Okay.
Norma,
Okay, fine.
Norma, thank you.
Okay. Stalin was the great defender of the revolution. People miss that point because of all the lies and distortions that the Western world has had to tell because of the great victory that communism is. The anti-communists helped create the World War II, and that means Americans and all the rich people of the world helped to move Hitler to try to overthrow the communist revolution. Atomic waste has 500,000 year half-lives. You know this already. See if you can count up how long half-lives of 500,000 years is for the atomic waste, and how many tests have been done. If those aren't called murderous work on Earth, which is all of us and all of life, while our owners continue to break Earth. If you get a chance, I would like you to take a look at Harper's issue, the June magazine, with the article titled, "Why Are We in Ukraine?" The way I'm saying it, of course, is not evident from the title, but I say that if you read that, you might get some idea. You know, somebody's worried about the gulags and and we have Grover Furr to have done all this research about the lies told about Stalin's criminality.
Also, the use of accidental, of the thought of accidental explosions of atomic bombs. That's wonderful. They've been using it for 50, 60 years for advancement of media, advancement of Hollywood. Okay. I think you got to understand the role of the nuclear horror being employed by even our owners. And I'm not saying it's not going to be done, but after 50, 60 years, whatever this is, you got to think about what's it really being used for. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you. That ends our Q&A for the minute. I'm going to now turn it over to anybody who has from the panel, Susan, Elaine, Norman, to make any last one-sentence statements.
I'd just like to start with thanking everybody who participated. Thank you for your questions, the stuff that you've put in chat, and I read some stories. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody also. As someone who remains below average in my computer and internet skills, I want to thank Cole and thank everybody. It was a rich and diverse and encouraging presentation. Now, what's important for us to do, I would say, is to get out there and begin to do things. That's the important thing, to act, to bring the messages that we have come forward with to the larger population, because we are in a time in American history right now when we face far-reaching repression, particularly of history, sociology, on a wide variety of issues.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Elaine.
And I'll just join my voice to say what a pleasure it was to be here, both with fellow panelists and with all of you participating and asking questions. And Marcus, thank you for organizing this, and Cole, thank you for enabling it. And let's hope that the next time we meet, things seem a little easier.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you for the panelists, and thank you everybody for being here.
Norman, I am a Communist Party member.
Okay, great.
There,
And I would be happy to see more and more people join. Okay.